Zulfi Bhutto of Pakistan, His Life and Times by Stanley Walpert. Chapter 12, Prime Minister Bhutto at the Peak of His Power, 1974. Zulfi celebrated his 46th birthday that January of 1974 with a most successful wild boar hunt by day as well as at night in his compound in Larkana. He was joined there by his old friend Pillow Moody, then president of the Swatantra Party of India, who hoped that together he and Zulfi, my friend, would bring peace to South Asia. Pillow's American wife, Veena, had flown with him to Larkana. I always liked Zulfi, she recalled. Of course, he was a womanizer, but I think he tried to do some good and he was a generous friend and host. Messages of acceptance of the forthcoming Islamic summit kept arriving from more than 30 heads of states, and Zulfi knew it would be his most important opportunity to show the world how great a diplomat he was and to treat his powerful and noble guests with the generous hospitality that every Pakistani aristocrat was taught from childhood. Nothing tasty or succulent would be missing from the conference in Lahore. Nothing tempting or delicious unavailable to sate the appetites of his guests by day or at night. Before the summit began, however, there were mundane matters of administration to handle. Nawab Bukti's resignation as governor of Balochistan was finally accepted by the Prime Minister in early January, and Mir Ahmad Yar Khan of Kalat was named to replace him. This did nothing to stop the civil war raging in the rugged and remote regions of that vast province. For the Mengals and the Murris and Bazinjo tribesmen knew that as long as their sardars remained prisoners of the central government and Tikka Khan's troops kept firing, there would be no peace for Balochistan, only the sword of continuing conflict. Bhutto nonetheless insisted wherever he went in Sindh and spoke that busy month that as long as his people's party was strong, Pakistan was strong and stable. And he truly believed that so long as he remained his people's leader, the party could not help but be strong and reflect the will of the people, because he was a mystic union with them, an instinctive understanding, intuitive empathy, which guided his footsteps along the otherwise obscure path to the watering place of wisdom. Wherever he stopped for his frantic tours, he collected the written appeals of those who came to see him and hear him, half naked and barefoot Harris or town laborers. The impoverished and powerless, women and children, all were encouraged to toss their folded paper messages, scribbled prayers, and hopes onto the platform where the Prime Minister stood, and each of them prayed that he or she would be the lucky one in 10,000 whose plea might be answered some day. Land returned, taxes reduced, fines or prison sentences negated by the great leader of the people, who could by a word or a stroke of the pen save or destroy a life, a dream. The whole world of countless Harris, whose hollow cheeked faces and imploring eyes looked up to him as they would to a Sufi saint or God Almighty. Like every ancient Raja of Sindh before him, Bhutto made it his practice during his birthday month to tour his region of Larkana. This year, he toured his neighbor Jitoi's region of Nawabshah as well, accompanied by the new chief minister, meeting their people, meting out justice. Pakistan's leading jurists and advocates met for 2 days in early February of 1974 in Karachi to discuss their ideas of justice and the many injustices that remained under the Constitution of 1973, whose fine section on fundamental rights had been suspended the day after that document was almost unanimously adopted. Draconian defense of Pakistan regulations continued instead to proliferate as they had during the darkest days of the military rule, and Bhutto's own Attorney General, frontier barrister Yahya Bakhtiar, called for their termination, advocating full and unfettered restoration of that elusive rule of law. that Barrister Bhutto so often bragged of when he travelled abroad. Bhutto, who addressed the learned gathering on 9th February, insisted that he was bound to view the issue of fundamental rights in the framework which lays greater stress on the fundamental rights of the nation as a whole to preserve its territorial integrity, to combat subversion, to retain a sense of security. Once the situation changes, and the change can be best evaluated by the government, which alone has all the relevant data at its disposal, the state of emergency will be discontinued. Senior Supreme Court advocate A.K. Brohi strongly disagreed with the Prime Minister's attempt to defend his rule by regulations for reasons of security. Brohi cautioned that all too often, alas, the doctrine of the rule of law and the principle of democracy are invoked by the custodians of the political power, not so much to render justice as to work injustice. It was not the last time that Brohi and Bhutto would confront each other at opposite sides of a legal dispute. A vast amount of legislation today consists of ordinances, treated as having the force of law by means of a polite legal friction. Brohi reminded his colleagues of Pakistan's bench and bar. Whether humanity will take the path that leads to freedom or the road to serfdom is an issue which is still an open one. The highest ideal for man is to let his conduct be regulated by the forces of reason, motivated unconditionally by the pursuit of the ideal of justice, concluded the soft spoken advocate who would serve as the Federation's lawyer 3 years later, when he spoke with equal passion in defense of the martial coup launched by Ziaul Haq against Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. Senior officials of most of the 38 Islamic countries, the PLO delegation was led by Yasir Arafat, attending the Lahore conference met on 18th February 1974, and for 3 days the Muslim foreign minister hammered out draft resolutions that would be considered by the conference convened in Lahore on 22nd February. Until the very eve of the formal convening, however, whether Prime Minister Mujibur Rahman of Bangladesh would attend remained unclear. But that evening, Prime Minister Bhutto dramatically appeared before a battery of television cameras and radio microphones to announce in solemn, almost lugubrious tones his momentous decision to recognize Bangladesh. Though Mujib had not as yet promised to drop his charges against the 195 Pakistani prisoners still held in India for possible trial as war criminals. Bhutto's bold initiative cleared the way for Mujib's attendance at the conference, thus at least symbolically reuniting the war-severed wings of old Pakistan. It was Zulfi's first summit coup, but would not be his only diplomatic victory during the most jubilant and spectacular week in the recent history of Lahore. In the name of Allah, most gracious, most merciful, Prime Minister Bhutto began in welcoming His Majesties, His Royal Highnesses, His Excellencies, and dear brothers in Islam to Pakistan's premier Islamic capital, whose old Mughal fort, Great Masjid, the largest mosque in all of South Asia, and beautiful Shalimar Gardens provided the proper backdrop for this singular gathering of the Muslim leaders of more than one-fifth of the humankind. As the home of Iqbal, moreover, and the venue of adoption of the Muslim League's famous 1940 resolution, known to the history as Pakistan's resolution, Lahore remained particularly significant in Pakistan's own history. Bhutto's address and the conference itself focused on the Arab-Israel conflict and how to resolve it. The tragedy of Palestine has agitated Muslim minds for half a century, Bhutto argued. Israel has gorged and fattened on the West's sympathies, nurtured itself on violence, and expanded through aggression. Situations arise in which there is no choice but war against the usurper. Such a situation was created for the Arab peoples. Zulfi never directly mentioned Kashmir during the conference but made a number of oblique references to it, including your host country has been a victim of international conspiracies and is concerned with an intense question in which its stand is based on nothing but justice and concern for Muslim rights. He had pointedly warned in reference to the Arab Israel conflict that disengagement is not peace. No Indian who heard or read that phrase had any doubt but that he was thinking of Tashkent and Simla. Not that Indira Gandhi or any of her representatives had been invited to the summit, but she and Swaran Singh and Keval Singh listened carefully and read and reread Bhutto's official and most of his unofficial statements, for he was no undergraduate declaiming his passionate pan Islamic message to an unsophisticated co ed in California. His attentive audience included King Faisal and President Sadat, Boumediene and Assad, the charismatic Colonel Gaddafi and Yasser Arafat. Among the Arab territories occupied by Israel, Al Quds, Jerusalem, holds a special place in Muslim hearts. Except for an interval during the Crusades, it has been a Muslim city. I repeat, a Muslim city. Let me make it very clear from this platform that any agreement, any protocol, any understanding which postulates the continuance of Israeli occupation of the Holy City or the transfer of the Holy City to any non Muslim or non Arab sovereignty will not be worth the paper it is written on. Then he coyly added, "This is not a threat. Yet, in this respect, there is a fire in our hearts which no prevarication, no skillful evasions on the part of others will ever be able to quench." It was not only as their most eloquent Muslim host and brother, however, that Zulfi Bhutto addressed this stellar audience in Lahore, but as a third world leader whose new economic strategy could topple the global dominance of both superpowers and the entire industrialized West. The third world has emphasized time and again that poverty and affluence cannot coexist. But we ourselves have not fully realized the nature and the value of economic power, nor grasped the urgent need of developing science and technology for our progress. Indeed, for our very survival. The war of last October has, however, precipitated a chain of events and created an environment in which the developing countries can at last hope to secure the establishment of a more equitable economic order. By the demonstrated ability of the oil producing countries to concert their policies and determine the price of their resources. This may well be a watershed in history. An unprecedented shift will occur in the global monetary and financial balance of power. The third world can now participate in the economic and financial councils of the world on an equal footing with the developed countries. Master of realpolitik strategy that he was, Bhutto always thought ahead. He could see himself at the helm of a third world coalition, including China someday, whose economic resources as well as its vast population would not only equal but even exceed the strength of either the first or second world of Western and Eastern powers. With Gaddafi and Sadat seated on one side of him and Faisal and Mujib on the other, he already felt potentially much stronger than India. It was an overwhelming transformation less than 3 years after the disastrous Bangladesh war. The Muslim countries are now so placed as to be able to play a most constructive and rewarding role for the cooperation among themselves. It is time that we translate the sentiments of Islamic unity into concrete measures of cooperation and mutual benefit. It will bring us strength in spirit and substance. In contrast to the materialistic West and spiritual East, Islamic nations have been called the people of the middle, Zulfi noted. Pakistan, as the midmost nation of the people of the middle, was charged with the mission of mediating conflicts. Zulfi was good at that, born diplomat that he was. He found it easy to hunt or speak with any Arabian sheikh as he did to drink or dine with any North African colonel or radical revolutionary. Yet Bhutto alone could never have brought so many disparate leaders together without the common enemy of Israel and its imperialist supporters to assist him. As I survey this splendid gathering, I recall that as a young student 26 years ago, I was asked to address a student body of the university, almost wholly non Muslim, on the Islamic heritage. I spoke of Muslim unity against exploitation and of Muslim revival and sketched a plan for a Muslim commonwealth. I ventured to predict that a movement in this direction would take shape in the next 20 years. Like all of us, I have been assailed by doubts whether this vision of mine would be fulfilled. Today, despite all difficulties in our path, I bow my head in gratitude to Allah for making me witness to a scene which should dispel those doubts. Not since the heyday of Mughal imperial glory had Lahore seen so many resplendent Muslim monarchs parade in its Shalimar gardens, where exultant cries of Bhutto Mujib, Bhai Bhai, Bhutto Mujib are brothers, alternated with Bhutto Zindabad. Few Pakistanis feared that any of the 195 prisoners would ever face a Bangladesh or Indian court, for Mujib openly said that he hoped the matter of the remaining prisoners would soon be resolved. All who saw the warm smiles and brotherly treatment Bhutto lavished on his old friend, Mujib suspected that a satisfactory deal had already been cut. A tripartite South Asian summit would soon be arranged. If Zulfi was the impresario hero host of Lahore conference, Gaddafi was its visiting superstar. The handsome young Libyan colonel captured the hearts, if not the minds, of virtually every Punjabi he smiled at or waved at, and nearly 100,000 turned out when he spoke to them at Lahore's new Gaddafi Stadium. He hailed Pakistan as a citadel of Islam in Asia and promised that Libya stood ready to sacrifice its blood if Pakistan were ever threatened. Our resources are your resources, he shouted. The captivated young crowd cheered almost loud enough to be heard without transmitters or monitors in New Delhi. Gaddafi enjoyed Pakistan so much that he lingered there 4 days after the conference ended, and the others, less close to Bhutto, flew home. Zulfi and Gaddafi resonated warmly to each other, and the Libyan firebrand promised his older brother much more than simply the oil and monetary support Bhutto needed. Libya was the first Arab nation to ship its oil at the cost of production to Karachi that year. The day after Gaddafi left, President Kenneth Kaunda of Zambia flew to Pindi and vigorously affirmed how non aligned Pakistan was, adding significant non Muslim support to Bhutto's dream of hosting an even grander Third World Summit someday. Malaysian Prime Minister Tun Abdul Razak attended the banquet Bhutto gave for Kaunda, and he and the Prime Minister of Lebanon both congratulated their host on the tremendous impact of his Islamic summit. The following Saturday, 9th March, Sheikh Zayed ibn Sultan Nahyan, President of the United Arab Emirates, flew back to Pindi for his own state visit. The Sheikh of Abu Dhabi loved to hunt wild boar with Bhutto, and they flew together to Larkana, where he laid the foundation stone for a women's hospital that remains one of the best such institutions in Pakistan. The Sheikh considered Lahore Conference a landmark in Islamic history and the beginning of a new era of Muslim unity and brotherhood. A PLO delegation and a much larger Egyptian parliamentary deputation also flew in and out of Pakistan in March, as did the chief of the Turkish General Staff and Special Soviet Envoy Boris Potsarov and Vice President Kang Ryang, UK, of the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea. A Saudi army team was scheduled to arrive in early April. Zulfi Bhutto's brilliant diplomatic initiative have put sleepy Pakistan high on everyone's list of important places to visit. The Lahore Conference paid handsome immediate dividends, bolstering Pakistan's no longer ailing economy. Zulfi slept at the official residence of his close friend Chief Minister Mustafa Khar throughout the Lahore conference. But a week later, Khar submitted his resignation, and 4 days later, Bhutto appointed Hanif Rame to the post. Khar had of late become a political liability to Bhutto. His notorious private life, discussed in grotesque detail by his former mistress and fifth or sixth wife, Tehmeena Durrani, did not offend Zulfi, who shared most of his younger friend's personal tastes and social habits. What did bother Bhutto, however, was Khar's increasing alienation of his own Punjab Assembly supporters in the Pakistan People's Party for the usual reasons of arrogance, impatience, lack of interest or concern in the party problems, because of his total preoccupation with more important problems of his own. Mustafa lost the backing of more than 40 of his Legislative Assembly colleagues. Former Punjab Chief Minister Malik Mehraj Khalid, a most astute political leader and also a friend of Bhutto's, had been displaced by his former governor without a word of thanks or apology. Cabinet Minister Khurshid Hassan Mir, another of Bhutto's earliest and strongest Pakistan People's Party's lieutenants, had also recently fallen out with Khar, especially after some of Khar's sycophants insisted on him, calling him Qaide Punjab, leader of the Punjab. Mir and others in the party high command felt there should be only two Qaids in Pakistan, Qaid-e-Azam Jinnah and Qaid-e-Awam Bhutto. Perhaps it was simply something Khar said during those several nights of the Lahore conference when Bhutto stayed with him, tone of voice or crooked smile that made Bhutto advise him to take some time off. It was not a permanent break as yet. Exactly 1 year later, Zulfi would reappoint Mustafa governor of Punjab, though not for long. Chief Minister Muhammad Hanif Rame was 6 years older than Khar, 3 years younger than Bhutto, but in some ways seemed centuries remote from those feudal landlords, for his was a middle class urban mentality, self effacing, artistically cultivated, forbearing. He had admired Bhutto's idealism and courage in attacking the military regimes of Yahya and Ayub Khan, whose once powerful heart was fast failing in Islamabad. Rame was a poet and a painter who saw the People's Party as a revolution of hope that would transform Pakistan into a true democracy. He worked hard to win popular support for the party's manifesto, believing in it. Though, at first, he was allied to Khar, he soon came to distrust him and to believe that Khar was incapable of leading Punjab's majority province towards any progressive or better future for the workers and peasants. So when Bhutto replaced Khar with Rame, it almost seemed an important change, not that sort of change in name only that had occurred when Jatoi moved to Mumtaz's chair. Yet everyone knew that Rame could do precious little without Bhutto's support. Indeed, he even waited for the Prime Minister's approval before naming his own cabinet, for especially in the year of the Islamic summit, Bhutto's word was law in Lahore as well as Karachi, Abu Dhabi, and Tripoli. Minister of State Aziz Ahmad flew to Delhi on 5th April to meet with the foreign ministers of India and Bangladesh, seeking to decide the fate of the 195 prisoners still held in India. The tripartite negotiations opened with cool and almost hostile exchanges, and the negotiations that were to have taken no more than 2 days dragged on for three without much apparent progress. Prime Minister Bhutto flew to Paris to continue his own top secret negotiations with the French government for aid in the highest priority effort to develop a nuclear arms capability. In a terse statement to the French press, Bhutto warned that unless all Pakistani prisoners were released quickly, the entire process of normalization of relations in South Asia could be dangerously reversed. Next day, the tripartite agreement was signed in New Delhi, and Bhutto flew home to another hero's welcome from his entire cabinet and party. He seemed incapable of making a wrong move, diplomatically at least. Bhutto next focused more creative, problem solving attention on Balochistan, holding a series of meetings with Tikka Khan and his top military advisors in Pindi. He decided to cease military operations in that rugged province from mid May onward and offer amnesty to all Balochi rebels who turned in their arms before mid October. It was the sort of bold gesture that appealed to Bhutto's astute political mind, for he was never afraid to reverse himself overnight, testing his opponents' resolve and often outwitting them with his ingenuity. Wali Khan did not accept Bhutto's overture, nor would Bazinjo, Mengal, or Murray speak to his peace offering emissaries as long as they remained behind bars. Hence, both frontier provinces remained beyond the Sindh Punjab limits of Bhutto's political reach, defying him, it seemed, challenging his claim to represent democratically, indeed, to embody the popular will, to epitomize the aspirations of all Pakistanis. A less egotistical political leader might have made his peace with that reality graciously, granting that it accurately reflected the tribal complexity of Pakistan's provincial pluralism and was no mortal attack against himself. But Zulfi could never accept political opposition with equanimity. He believed it his destiny to lead all of Pakistan, and he wanted every Pakistani to love and support him in that task, that leadership labor for which he was born and had so uniquely educated and trained himself. It was an insult to his izzat, his personal feudal honor, to be challenged, mistrusted, openly attacked in provincial assemblies and press conferences. I had come from Kabul only after I was assured that there was democracy in the country. Venerable Abdul Ghaffar Khan, Wali Khan's 85-year-old father, now under house arrest in Peshawar, told Yusuf Lodhi that April. But what I saw here was worst ever dictatorship. It was virtually a one-man rule. Frontier Governor Aslam Khattak and his Chief Minister Inayatullah Khan, Gandapur, managed just barely to control their almost equally divided provincial assembly, thus keeping Wali Khan's National Awami Party out of power in Peshawar. Zulfi suspected that both Khattak and Gandapur were secretly dealing with Wali Khan and urged his young frontier cabinet minister Hayat Muhammad Khan Sherpao to return to Peshawar, where he would take control of the Pakistan People's Party bloc in the provincial assembly and then displace Gandapur as chief minister. Zulfi liked Sherpao and trusted him, but Khattak feared that if he appointed this charismatic young man chief minister, he would no longer be in control of NWFP. In May, Khattak was thrown out by Bhutto, and shortly after that, Sherpa moved in to take charge of the northwest frontier province. But he would not long enjoy that much coveted provincial power before being assassinated. Prime Minister Bhutto flew to China on 11th May 1974 and was soon closeted for an hour and a half with Mao Zedong and Chow Enlil, both of whom promised him military support, including aid in developing Pakistan's nuclear capability. Vice Premier Teng House Lee Ping hosted a banquet for Bhutto the next night and spoke effusively about the Lahore Conference, hailing it as a new contribution to the Third World countries' cause of unity against hegemonism. The latter term, of course, was China's way of referring to the Soviet Union. Before the end of his welcoming speech, Teng added a similarly modern Chinese reference to India. Our Pakistani friends may rest assured that, come what may, the Chinese government and people will, as always, firmly support Pakistan in defense of national independence, state sovereignty, and territorial integrity, and against hegemonism and expansionism, and firmly support the people of Kashmir in their struggle for the right to self determination. At the mention of Kashmir, the Indian ambassador left the banquet. I am really baffled and puzzled, Zulfi commented on the departure of his opponent to the vice premier's speech. That when we are promoting good relations, friendship, that the representative of India should choose to leave this banquet. Does India want conflict and confrontation instead of cooperation and friendly relations? If India wants that, then I can tell you that Pakistan is prepared for it. Less than 2 weeks later, on 18th May 1974, India answered Bhutto's Beijing reaffirmation of Kashmir's right to a plebiscite by exploding a plutonium device in a deep salt cave in Rajasthan, close enough to Sindh, seismically to jolt that province, shaking the revived self confidence of many Pakistanis in their so recently enhanced defenses. Let me make it clear that we are determined not to be intimidated by this threat. Bhutto assured his nation the next day that we will never let Pakistan be a victim of nuclear blackmail. In concrete terms, we will not compromise the right of self determination of the people of Jammu and Kashmir, nor will we accept Indian hegemony. From the day I assumed office, I have been conscious of the dire necessity of our having a coherent nuclear program.